On April 2, 2024, the jagged shoreline of Lake Michigan at Warnemont Park surrendered a secret that would freeze the blood of Milwaukee. A passerby, expecting the usual lakefront debris, instead found a severed human leg, removed with chilling precision. This wasn't a random act of street violence. It was the final chapter of a first date. 19-year-old Sade Robinson had spent the previous evening sharing a seafood dinner, unaware she was sitting across from a dismemberer. Maxwell Anderson hadn't just ended her life. He had begun a calculated attempt to dismantle her entire existence. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. To understand the horror that unfolded on the shores of Lake Michigan, one must first look at the two lives that were destined to collide in the most violent way imaginable. Sade Robinson was the embodiment of ambition, a 19-year-old who moved through the streets of Milwaukee with a purpose that many her age had yet to find. She was a student at Milwaukee Area Technical College, her sights set firmly on a career in criminal justice. Her mother often remarked on her daughter's fierce independence, describing her as a young woman who refused to let anyone dictate her pace or dampen her spirit. To Sade, the world was an organized place, or at least it was supposed to be, and she spent her hours studying the very laws meant to protect citizens, unaware that she would soon become the center of a case that would test the limits of those very statutes. Her daily routine was a testament to a tireless work ethic. She held a position at Pizza Shuttle, a local landmark on the city's east side, where the air was a constant mix of toasted flour and industrial tomato sauce. She wasn't merely an employee there, she was a vibrant, essential presence, recognized by her coworkers for the pride she took in her distinct Honda Civic and her ability to brighten the room. Her friends saw a woman who loved the finer points of life, fashion, music, and the simple joy of an evening out, but who was also deeply disciplined about her future. She was only weeks away from a graduation ceremony that symbolized her transition into the professional world she so admired. A daughter of the South who had moved from Mississippi to Wisconsin, she had built a life based on potential and the warmth she offered to everyone in her social circle. In sharp, jagged contrast stood Maxwell Anderson. At 33, he was a man whose life appeared to be a series of diminishing returns and discarded opportunities. He resided in a two-story home on North 33rd Street, a property owned by his father, who was a successful and well-regarded local businessman. The house was an unassuming structure on the city's west side, sitting quietly on a tree-lined street, yet the atmosphere within its walls was far from peaceful. Anderson had spent much of his adult life drifting through the service industry, most notably working as a bartender at several high-profile Milwaukee venues. To the patrons he served, he was merely a face behind the mahogany, a man who could hold a brief conversation, but often left people with an inexplicable sense of unease. His coworkers, however, were far less charitable in their assessments, recalling a man with a hair-trigger temper who could oscillate between professional competence and terrifying, unprovoked outbursts of rage in a matter of seconds. Anderson's personal history was a ledger of warning signs that had been accumulating for years. His criminal record included past incidents of domestic battery and disorderly conduct, pointing toward a deep-seated struggle with impulse control and an inherent disregard for the safety of others. He was a man who felt a constant sense of entitlement to his space and his opinions, often clashing violently with anyone who dared to challenge his authority. Those who had known him intimately spoke of a suffocating, controlling nature that defined his romantic relationships. He seemed obsessed with maintaining a veneer of normalcy, yet his private life was a chaotic mess of simmering resentment and a perceived lack of the success his father had achieved. This gap between his reality and his ego appeared to fuel a desire for a different, darker kind of power, the kind that comes from total dominance over another human being. The Milwaukee that Sade navigated was one of community and progress, defined by the hum of the campus library and the frantic energy of a busy pizza shop. For her, the city was a map of opportunities waiting to be seized. For Maxwell, the city was something else entirely. It was a landscape masked by the mundane, where he could observe the social rhythms of the young women who frequented the bars where he worked. He was a man who understood the digital world, using social media and dating apps to bridge the gap between his isolated house and the vibrant world Sade inhabited. He had learned how to wear the skin of a normal man, a bartender who knew how to listen just enough to make a stranger feel safe in his presence. In the weeks leading up to April 2024, Sade was focused on finalizing her academic projects and looking forward to a life in law enforcement. She was a young woman who genuinely believed in the system of justice. Maxwell, conversely, was retreating further into his own dark contemplations. His house on 33rd Street had become a setting where his long-held fantasies and his history of violence were beginning to coalesce into a dangerous intent. He was not a man who had suddenly lost his grip on reality. He was a man who had been methodically building a monument to his own darkness for over a decade. The tragedy of Sade Robinson was not just that she encountered a killer, but that she met a man who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of hiding a predatory nature behind the most ordinary of masks. The digital landscape of 2024 served as the hunting ground where the paths of Sade Robinson and Maxwell Anderson first began to intertwine. In an era where human connection is often mediated by the glow of a smartphone screen, their initial interaction was as mundane as it was ultimately catastrophic. They met through a dating application, a platform designed to foster romance that, in this instance, became a gateway for a predator. To Sade, Maxwell likely appeared as just another potential suitor in the bustling Milwaukee social scene, a 33-year-old with deep roots in the city, a man who possessed the conversational polish of a seasoned bartender. Their early correspondence was a masterclass in the mask of normalcy that Maxwell had spent decades refining. He portrayed himself as someone grounded yet adventurous, utilizing the specific cadence of modern dating apps to build a sense of rapid, unearned intimacy. He asked the right questions, mirrored her interests, and projected a version of himself that was safe and approachable. For Sade, the interaction was filled with the usual optimism of a young woman looking for a meaningful connection. She shared details about her studies and her aspirations in criminal justice, unknowingly providing her interlocutor with the very profile he would eventually seek to destroy. Friends would later recall that she seemed genuinely interested in the man who appeared to be so attentive to her life. She mentioned to those closest to her that she had a date planned with someone who seemed different from the usual crowd. However, beneath the surface of these digital exchanges, a much darker reality was simmering in the house on North 33rd Street. Maxwell Anderson was not looking for a partner. He was searching for a target. His history of domestic outbursts and controlling behavior suggests that his interest in Sade was rooted in a psychological need for dominance rather than any genuine romantic impulse. In the days leading up to their meeting, Maxwell's digital footprint revealed a man increasingly isolated within his own disturbing thoughts. He was a regular in the city's nightlife, but he was always an outsider looking in, a man who felt the world owed him a level of success and admiration that his own volatile personality constantly sabotaged. The preparation for this meeting was a study in horrific duality. On one side of the city, Sade was preparing for an evening out with the excitement typical of a 19-year-old. She picked out her outfit with care, checked her hair in the mirror, and sent a selfie to her friends to show off her look for the night. She was a woman who lived in the light, a person who documented her joy and her progress with a sense of transparency. She saw April 1st not as a day for pranks, but as the beginning of a new month, a step closer to her college graduation. She moved through her apartment with a sense of rhythm, perhaps playing music as she got ready, the four walls of her home filled with the energy of a life just beginning to bloom. Across town, the atmosphere in Maxwell Anderson's home was cold and clinical. While he likely spent some time ensuring his own physical appearance met the standards of a respectable date, the true preparation was happening in the recesses of his mind and the dark corners of his basement. This was a man who understood the geography of his own house as a tactical space. The entitlement he felt over his surroundings, a house provided by his father, extended to the people he invited inside. Investigators would later scrutinize the state of his residence, finding evidence that suggested his environment was organized for something far more sinister than a simple home-cooked meal or a post-date drink. He wasn't just planning a dinner, he was orchestrating an encounter where he would have total control over the variables. The choice of April 1st for their meeting adds a layer of bitter irony to the tragedy. As the city of Milwaukee prepared for the usual lightheartedness of the day, these two individuals were finalizing the logistics of a meeting that would result in the death of one and the lifelong incarceration of the other. They agreed to meet at Duke's on Water, a popular downtown spot known for its casual atmosphere and seafood. The location was strategic for Maxwell. It was a public place where he could continue to perform his nice guy persona, a neutral ground where Sade would feel comfortable enough to eventually leave her own vehicle behind and step into his. Their final messages on the afternoon of April 1st were brief and functional, focused on timing and arrival. There was no indication in Sade's tone that she felt any trepidation, no last-minute hesitation that suggested her intuition was screaming. She trusted the process of the app, the safety of the public venue, and the seemingly harmless identity of the man she had been messaging. For Maxwell, those final clicks and swipes were the closing of a trap. He was a man who had spent his life failing to achieve greatness through legitimate means, and he had now turned toward a horrific, perverse form of achievement through the destruction of another. As the sun began to set over the Milwaukee skyline, the digital connection was about to become a physical reality. Sade Robinson climbed into her Honda Civic, a car she took immense pride in, and began the drive toward downtown. She was moving toward what she believed was a standard first date, a chance to enjoy a meal, share some stories, and perhaps find a spark. She was traveling toward a man who had already decided her fate, a man who viewed her not as a person with dreams and a family, but as a vessel for his own incomprehensible rage. The connection they had built over the previous days was a bridge made of glass, and Sade was walking across it with the confidence of the innocent, unaware of the abyss Maxwell Anderson had dug beneath her feet. The calendar read April 1st, 2024, a date usually reserved for harmless deceptions. But as the sun dipped below the Milwaukee skyline, a very real and irreversible sequence of events began to unfold. For Sade Robinson, the evening started with the standard rituals of a 19-year-old preparing for a night out. She moved through her apartment with an energy fueled by the anticipation of a first date, unaware that every choice she made, the clothes she picked, the messages she sent, the route she took, was being etched into a timeline that investigators would later obsess over. She was dressed in a white sweatshirt and light-colored pants, a bright ensemble that stood out against the darkening streets. Shortly before 9 in the evening, she climbed into her black Honda Civic, a vehicle that represented her independence and hard-earned success, and began the drive toward the heart of the city. The destination was Duke's on Water, a staple of the Milwaukee nightlife, located in the bustling downtown district. The air that evening carried the sharp, lingering chill of a Wisconsin spring, the kind of cold that makes the warmth of a crowded bar feel like a sanctuary. Sade arrived and found Maxwell Anderson already waiting. To anyone glancing at the booth, they were just another pair of strangers navigating the awkward, polite dance of a first meeting. The surveillance footage from inside the establishment would later become a haunting artifact of this normalcy. It showed a man and a woman sitting across from each other, sharing a seafood dinner. They appeared engaged, the conversation flowing between bites of food and sips of drinks. Maxwell, drawing on years of experience behind various bars in the city, performed the role of the attentive listener with practiced ease. He leaned in, he nodded, he maintained the level of eye contact that signals interest without crossing into the territory of the unsettling. For nearly 90 minutes, they existed in this public bubble. The ambient noise of the bar, the clinking of silverware, the low hum of other patrons' lives, the occasional burst of laughter from the bar, provided a thick layer of social safety. Sade seemed comfortable. She wasn't checking her phone for an exit strategy. She wasn't looking toward the door with apprehension. She was a woman who lived by the rules of criminal justice she was studying, and in this well-lit public space, there were no rules being broken. Maxwell remained the consummate professional of the nice guy persona. He didn't rush the meal. He didn't exhibit the hair-trigger temper that had defined his past. He was patient. He was waiting for the moment the social safety net would be withdrawn. Around 10:30 p.m., the atmosphere of the date shifted from the public to the private. The decision was made to leave Duke's, and it is here that the tactical nature of Maxwell's plan became evident. Sade didn't drive her own car to the next location. Instead, she left her Honda Civic parked near the bar, a beacon of her identity left behind in the downtown shadows, and stepped into Maxwell's vehicle. This move, while common in the world of dating, effectively stripped Sade of her mobility and her primary means of escape. They began the drive toward the west side, moving away from the security of the crowds and toward the quiet residential isolation of North 33rd Street. The drive took them through streets that Maxwell knew intimately, past the bars where he had worked and the neighborhoods where he had lived out his frustrated ambitions. As they pulled up to the two-story house, the silence of the neighborhood likely felt like a natural transition from a long evening of talking. The house, a property that symbolized both his father's success and his own stagnation, sat under the yellow glow of a street lamp. Inside, the environment was vastly different from the warmth of the restaurant. It was a space Maxwell controlled entirely, a domain where his impulses were no longer moderated by the presence of witnesses. The timeline of what happened behind those closed doors is a grim reconstruction based on digital footprints and forensic gaps. Sade's phone, which had been active throughout the evening, began to fall silent. The vibrant stream of communication she maintained with her world, the check-ins with friends, the social media updates, petered out as she crossed the threshold of the house on 33rd Street. Maxwell's presence in the house was not that of a host, but of a predator who had finally secured his quarry in his lair. The sensory details of that final hour are lost to the silence of the house, but the physical evidence later recovered paints a picture of a sudden and violent transition. The basement, a utilitarian space of concrete and shadows, would become the focus of the most intense forensic scrutiny. It was here that the date night killer shed the skin of the polite bartender and embraced the monster that had been simmering beneath his surface for years. There were no more polite nods or shared stories. There was only the terrifying reality of a man who viewed human life as something that could be dismantled and discarded. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the city of Milwaukee slept, unaware that a block away from its main thoroughfares, a horrific crime was being committed with methodical cruelty. Maxwell Anderson was not acting in a heat of passion. His actions over the following hours suggested a cold, clinical detachment. He began the process of attempting to erase Sade Robinson, not just from the world of the living, but from the physical record entirely. The precision with which he worked hinted at a dark preoccupation with anatomy and the mechanics of disposal. He wasn't just a murderer, he was a man who sought to undo the very humanity of his victim. Outside, the neighborhood remained still. No neighbors reported screams. No one noticed anything unusual about the house on 33rd Street. Maxwell had ensured that the final act of this date was a solitary one. By the time the first hints of dawn began to gray the sky on April 2nd, the bright, ambitious young woman who had walked into Duke's on water with a smile was gone. In her place was a crime scene that would soon defy the comprehension of even the most seasoned investigators. Maxwell Anderson sat in the silence of his home, surrounded by the remnants of his horrific work, already beginning to calculate his next move, the disposal of the evidence and the burning of the car that still sat as a silent witness to the woman he had just destroyed. The silence of April 2nd didn't begin with a scream, it began with a void. At Pizza Shuttle, the morning shift was in full-blown motion, the scent of rising dough and industrial ovens filling the air, but the familiar black Honda Civic was missing from its usual spot. Sade Robinson was many things, but she was never late. By noon, the silence from her phone transformed from a minor curiosity into a cold, creeping dread that settled in the stomachs of everyone who knew her. Her manager, acutely aware of the 19-year-old's meticulous nature and her excitement for her upcoming graduation, reached out to her mother, Sheena Scarborough. It was the first pebble in an avalanche. Sade's mother tried the phone. No answer. She tried the Life 360 tracking app. The digital beacon that usually pinned Sade to a specific coordinate was stagnant, eventually pointing toward a residential area on the west side that held no significance to the family. It was a digital dead end that whispered of something gone wrong. The first physical sign that the first date had spiraled into a nightmare appeared around 7:30 that morning, while the city was just waking up to its morning coffee. The Milwaukee Fire Department received an urgent call to the corner of 29th and Lisbon Avenue. A car was engulfed in flames, the black paint bubbling and peeling under the intense heat of an accelerant-fueled blaze. When the fire was finally suppressed, leaving a skeleton of scorched metal and the acrid stench of burnt rubber, investigators looked at the charred remains of a Honda Civic. The interior was a blackened husk. The seats, the personal belongings, the very DNA of the vehicle's owner were being scrubbed away by the fire. It wasn't just a car fire, it was a forensic erasure. The license plate, miraculously spared enough to be read, confirmed the family's worst fears. It was Sade's car, but Sade was nowhere to be found. While the police were processing the scorched metal on the west side, the community was already mobilizing with a ferocity that only comes from a collective sense of injustice. This wasn't a girl who ran away. This was a girl who had a graduation gown waiting for her, a girl with a plan. Her mother and friends began a frantic, grassroots search, moving between the last known pings of her phone and the site of the burned car. They knocked on doors, they checked alleyways, and they screamed her name into the biting Milwaukee wind. The response from the authorities, initially measured as they processed the car fire, shifted into high gear as the realization set in that a 19-year-old college student had vanished simultaneously with the destruction of her most prized possession. Then came the moment that changed the investigation from a search for a missing person to the recovery of a victim. It happened nearly 5 miles away from the burned car, on the tranquil, wind-swept shores of Lake Michigan. At Warnemont Park in Kudai, a bystander was walking along the bluff, looking out over the gray, churning expanse of the water. Beneath the bluffs, near a pumping station, something caught their eye, a shape that didn't belong to the natural geography of the beach. It was a human leg, severed just below the hip with a chilling, surgical precision. The limb was pale, pristine despite its violent separation, and it bore a distinct, heartbreaking mark of identity. The toenails were painted with a fresh, vibrant polish, a detail that matched the description of the girl who had dressed so carefully for a date the night before. The discovery at the park sent a shockwave through the local precinct. The geographical disconnect was baffling and pointed toward a predator who knew the city's layout all too well. A car burned on the north side, a limb found on the south side. The killer was using the city as a map for his disposal, tossing fragments of a life into different zip codes as if he were trying to confuse the very compass of justice. As the sun set on April 2nd, the park was cordoned off with yellow tape, the silence of the nature preserve broken by the static of police radios and the heavy boots of forensic teams. For the Robinson family, the news of the leg was a crushing blow, yet they refused to surrender to despair. Until a full body was found, they clung to the impossible hope that the forensic evidence belonged to someone else. But the reality was settling in like a heavy, suffocating fog. The girl who had been studying the mechanics of crime was now the subject of the city's most gruesome file. The search continued through the night, with divers braving the frigid, unforgiving waters of the lake and drones hovering over the dense brush of the park. Every piece of clothing found, every discarded bag, was treated with the reverence of a holy relic. The search was no longer just about Sade, it was about the man she had been seen with. While the family searched the woods, detectives were pulling the security footage from Duke's On Water. They were looking at the man in the booth, the man who had shared the seafood, the man who was now the only person who knew where the rest of Sade Robinson was hidden. The city was on edge. Rumors of a date night killer began to circulate through the college campuses, turning the once safe practice of meeting strangers into a source of paralyzing fear. Maxwell Anderson had remained silent, but the trail he left, the smoke from the Civic and the blood on the beach, was beginning to speak for him. The search was narrowing, moving from the vast expanse of Lake Michigan back toward the house on North 33rd Street. The emotional toll on the community during those first 48 hours was visceral. Milwaukee is a city of neighborhoods, and the disappearance of a young woman who had made the city her home felt like a collective injury. The pizza shuttle became a makeshift vigil site, with regulars and strangers alike leaving flowers and notes. Detectives, meanwhile, were battling the frustration of red herrings. The burned car at 29th and Lisbon was a message of defiance. By choosing such a public location to torch the vehicle, the perpetrator was showing a complete lack of fear. The fire had been so intense that much of the interior was vaporized, leaving the forensic teams to sift through ash and slag in hopes of finding a single, unburned clue. The search was now a psychological puzzle. Investigators were trying to get inside the mind of a man who could sit through a dinner and then, hours later, stand on a beach in the dead of night, disposing of a human life. The focus shifted entirely to Maxwell Anderson, a man who was about to find out that the city he tried to hide his crimes in was much smaller than he thought. The investigation into Maxwell Anderson was not a sprint. It was a grueling, methodical excavation of a man's life. Detectives in Milwaukee, already reeling from the discovery of the limb at Warnemont Park, began to pull at the digital threads that connected Sade Robinson to her killer. The first breakthrough came from the very place where the date had supposedly flourished, the surveillance cameras at Duke's On-Water. The footage was grainier than a celluloid dream, but it was definitive. It showed Maxwell Anderson sitting in a booth with Sade. It showed them leaving together. It showed Sade stepping into his car, and her own Honda Civic left behind like a discarded shell in the downtown shadows. The red herrings initially plagued the precinct. Was it a carjacking gone wrong? Had Sade been intercepted by someone else after she left the bar? The burning of her car on the north side seemed like a tactic to throw the scent toward the city's more volatile neighborhoods. But the digital footprint told a different story. Investigators obtained a warrant for Maxwell's phone records and the Life 360 data from Sade's device. The results were a map of a nightmare. On the night of April 1st, both phones pinged together at Maxwell's residence on North 33rd Street. Then, in the early hours of April 2nd, Maxwell's phone traveled to Warnemont Park, the exact location where the leg was found. The digital trail didn't just suggest his presence, it tracked his every movement as he played the role of a modern-day Sharon, moving between the site of the murder and the desolate sites of disposal. On April 4th, 2024, the investigation moved from the digital to the visceral. A swarm of forensic technicians, clad in white Tyvek suits that stood out against the gray industrial landscape of the West Side, descended upon the house on North 33rd Street. The air inside the residence was thick with the scent of pine cleaner and stale air, a desperate olfactory attempt to mask what had occurred. In the basement, the true nature of Maxwell Anderson's intent was laid bare. Beneath the flickering glow of overhead shop lights, the concrete floor whispered of violence. Using luminol, a chemical that causes blood to glow a ghostly blue under ultraviolet light, technicians revealed a constellation of splatters across the walls and the floor. It was a map of a struggle, a record of the final moments of a woman who had simply wanted a dinner out. They found more than just pings and splatters. In the basement, investigators discovered a blood-soaked rug and evidence of a hasty, incomplete cleanup. The DNA profile from the blood in the basement matched the DNA from the severed limb found on the beach. It was a 1 in a billion match. The realization that Sade Robinson had been dismantled in this subterranean space turned the stomachs of even the most hardened veterans on the force. Maxwell Anderson hadn't just killed her, he had used his father's house as a workshop for a horrific experiment in disposal. The arrest of Maxwell Anderson was as unremarkable as his crime was spectacular. On April 4th, police conducted a traffic stop on a vehicle he was driving. He didn't run, he didn't scream. He sat in the cruiser with a chilling, vacant expression that would become his hallmark in the months to follow. Inside his car, detectives found more than just a suspect. They found the remnants of his frantic attempts to hide the truth. They found a container of accelerant, likely the same kind used to torch Sade's Honda Civic. They found gloves. They found a man who believed he was smarter than the system Sade had dedicated her life to studying. He told the investigators he had no idea where the girl had gone after they parted ways, but the evidence in his back seat suggested a far more permanent separation. But the horror wasn't over. As the investigation deepened, more parts of Sade Robinson began to appear, surfacing like fragments of a broken promise. An arm was found in a separate part of the city. More remains were discovered in the dense undergrowth near the lake. The methodology was clear. Maxwell was trying to make it impossible for a complete body to ever be recovered. He was gambling on the idea that without a whole victim, the case against him would crumble. He underestimated the power of forensic science and the tenacity of the Milwaukee community. The why began to emerge as detectives looked into Maxwell's past. They spoke to ex-girlfriends who recounted a man who could turn from a charming companion to a violent controller in the blink of an eye. They found a history of domestic battery, documented instances where he had physically assaulted women who dared to assert their independence. To Maxwell, Sade wasn't a student or a daughter. She was a challenge to his perceived authority. The date night killer wasn't a new creation. He was the final, inevitable evolution of a man who had spent his life practicing for this very moment. The investigation also touched on the social echo of the crime. In the bars where Maxwell had worked, the regulars were stunned. They remembered him as the guy who made a decent old-fashioned, the guy who was a bit intense, but seemingly harmless. The fear that swept through the city's dating scene was palpable. Every ping on a dating app now felt like a potential threat. The investigation had moved beyond the walls of the basement and the shores of the lake. It had become a cultural reckoning for a city that suddenly felt much less safe. By the time the formal charges were being prepared, the evidence was an alpine peak of data and DNA. They had the surveillance footage, the phone pings, the blood in the basement, the accelerant in the car, and the biological matches for every limb recovered. Maxwell Anderson sat in his cell, his silence a shield he believed would protect him, but the evidence was speaking for Sade Robinson. It was telling the story of a 19-year-old who had walked into a trap and a man who had methodically tried to erase her existence. The investigation was over, but the trial and the search for the rest of Sade was just beginning. The legal reckoning for Maxwell Anderson unfolded in a Milwaukee courtroom, where the staggering weight of forensic evidence resulted in a historic $5 million bond. He stood charged with first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, and arson, a trifecta of crimes that painted him as a ghost of the city's darkest impulses. Throughout the preliminary hearings and the trial, Anderson maintained a posture of chilling indifference, his expression remaining a blank canvas even as the prosecution displayed the horrific evidence recovered from his North 33rd Street basement. He rarely looked toward the gallery, where Sade's family sat in a unified front of grief and resilience. The prosecution's case was a surgical reconstruction of the night of April 1st, using digital pings and biological matches to close every possible door of escape. By the time the verdict was delivered in late 2025, the date night killer was no longer a phantom of the dating apps, but a convicted man facing the rest of his natural life behind bars. The trial served as a final public declaration that while Maxwell had tried to dismantle Sade's body, he could never dismantle her name or her legacy. The memory of the 19-year-old remains a rallying cry for safety in a digital age that often masks true intentions. Her graduation gown, once a symbol of a beginning, now serves as a persistent reminder of a life stolen by a man who perfected the art of deception. The shoreline of Lake Michigan has returned to its quiet rhythm, but Milwaukee is forever changed. More vigilant, more protective of its daughters. Justice was served in a courtroom, but for a mother facing an empty chair, the search for peace remains as vast as the lake itself. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.